The methods of punishment in ancient China were severe, not to say inhumane, and for a good reason. The term Chinese torture has spread throughout the world to refer to the most chilling situations that you can face today. In a civilization that from a time before we can remember is driven to maintain a harmony among its people, the penalties imposed to achieve such tranquility ranged from being branded for life to the most painful death. Today, we will discover piece by piece the punishments that generated nightmares in ancient Chinese society. The worst punishment for women in ancient China. Even the women of ancient China were not spared from being sentenced to one of these punishments. In fact, they had their own catalogue of tortures, which was nothing to be envied by the men. It is true that for women, there were some punishments that were more bearable. Some consisted of forced labor or pressing their fingers against 2 pieces of wood, while the least painful punishment for a man was to be whipped with a bamboo cane. But this does not mean that women were spared, since, depending on the crime, they could even lose their lives. Among the most painful tortures applied mainly to women was the so-called wooden donkey, which consisted of a triangular-shaped wooden structure and a few logs or sticks to support it. Women who committed adultery were forced to sit on this torture device for hours at a time, which caused permanent injuries that prevented them from walking again without experiencing great pain. With the intention of increasing the punishment for these women, heavy objects were hung from their feet to make the injuries worse. There were also some wooden donkeys that had spikes on the area where the person sat. As a result of this, they damaged the parts that had contact with the spikes even more. Death by 1,000 cuts was the worst possible punishment for a prisoner. The most feared sentence. The most agonizing end that anyone could face in ancient China was called ling koi, or death by 1,000 cuts, preserved only for the worst criminals, and considered one of the cruelest punishments in the history of mankind. Any person that dared to commit one of the so-called 10 abominations, which included treason, murder of your husband, wife, or parents' rebellion, and witchcraft, were condemned to a slow and painful death. This consisted of tying the prisoner to a post by their hands and feet, putting a piece of opium in their mouth to lessen the pain on some occasions, and then slowly cutting the flesh from their body like a beef steak, depositing it in front of them until they passed out and died. Generally, the torture, both physical and psychological, lasted only about 20 minutes, which possibly for the poor person would be eternal before passing out. However, there are records of a person who lasted 12 hours before being able to rest in peace. In the event that the family of the prisoner was good, means there was a possibility of bribing the executioner so that he would kill him with a first cut before proceeding with the others to spare him such unpleasant suffering. This horrible practice began during the 10th century, and it was not until 1905 that it was banned, which puts us just over 100 years away from what was a nightmare come true. The last person sent to this death was an assassin who took the life of his employer and insulted the empress. For this, the execution was a special grotesque lasting 3 days until all the skin was removed from the body. All of this was documented in a series of striking photographs that technological advances of the time allowed. And that let us imagine the suffering of all those prisoners. The 5 punishments for slaves in ancient China. In China, there were 5 categories of punishments that were created with the intention of keeping the people under control and maintaining social harmony. These punishments differentiated between men and women, with women's punishments being less severe, because patriarchal society did not hold women responsible for their crimes unless they committed adultery, murder, or witchcraft, making them liable to sadistic tortures or even death. In all its different variants, during all the dynasties, the punishments were practically the same. They depended on the seriousness of your crime. the category to which you belong, and the severity with which it was applied among the punishments for men. The first and least severe was to tattoo the crime you committed on your face to present to society. The tattooed was larger depending on the seriousness of the crime. This punishment was applied mainly to slaves who ran away from their masters or for petty theft. The second level consisted of cutting off your nose without any anesthesia, destroying your sense of smell, and sometimes the ability to breathe through the remaining orifices. This punishment was reserved for those who committed a major theft. For those who committed a more heinous crime, either or both feet were amputated if they considered the damage done to be severe. One variant was to open your leg at the knee and remove the kneecap, making it impossible for you to walk for the rest of your life. In second to last place was castration. This sentence consisted of cutting off the man's reproductive organs and forcing him to work as a eunuch for an important or royal person. These unfortunate ones were people who committed adultery or fell into corruption, and as a last resort death, in any of its forms being the most painful for mass murderers or traitors of royalty. Thanks to the teachings of Confucianism, punishments evolved and became less brutal with the beginning of imperial China. However, death penalties were still the order of the day. Torture was regularly used against prisoners in ancient China. Law in ancient China was an important pillar for the control and harmony of society based on the idea of crime and punishment, influenced by philosophical currents such as Confucianism and legalism. Han Fei, founder of legalism, believed that the ruler alone should possess power and exercise it as a thunderbolt. Following these ideas, it was established by law that every person guilty of a crime had to confess the crime in order to be sentenced. So it was incorporated in the legal code that if the crime was voluntarily confessed, the punishment was to be reduced or even annulled, only being responsible for the losses except in the cases of murder, bodily injury, or property damage. However, many prisoners did not confess. So, other methods were used throughout the investigation process. The defendants had to present themselves before an official who asked them simple questions. If the prisoners refused to answer, simple torture was applied to obtain confessions, which consisted of twisting the accused arms around a post while they were continuously beaten. However, this was only the simplest form of torture employed. There existed some torture techniques that were somewhat exotic and beyond the human imagination. For example, the so-called bamboo torture, in which the prisoner was placed on a bamboo plant, so that over time it would grow and slowly impale him. There was also the famous water torture, which consists of leaving water dripping on the head of a tied-up prisoner until the water begins to make its way through the skull, a process that lasted for days, often driving the person to insanity before he was even injured by the water. These methods led some innocent people to confess to a crime they had not committed in order to stop the torture. Later, with the intention of saving time and money in the judicial processes of the era, torture became a frequent and indispensable tool in almost every trial, corrupting legal principles and laying the groundwork for the prevalence of forced confessions. Something that may sound familiar to you: today's dreaded Chinese execution vans. Currently, more people are executed for crimes in China that are executed for crimes in all other countries in a year combined. Although this number has decreased over time, it's now estimated that more than 1,000 criminals are sentenced to death each year. In China, there are 46 capital crimes for which you can be sentenced to death, ranging from inciting a riot or espionage to attempting to escape from prison or selling counterfeit drugs. Until 1997, executions of criminals were carried out by firing squads. They would have to designate a special area for the execution to be held as close as possible to where the prisoner was staying and would move him to this area due to the high cost and effort of the authorities to carry out the executions that were increasingly in demand. Execution vans were created which were equipped with a stretcher and the necessary elements to administer lethal injections. This allowed executions to be carried out on the spot where the prisoner was held, saving the government tons of money, helping to develop these death bans, and claiming a more humane way to carry out executions. Although death sentence proceedings in China are similar to those in the US, with the possibility of appealing a death sentence and lethal injection being virtually the same. It has been noted that these dreaded vans are so convenient and facilitate the execution so well that they are likely to make them the bread and butter of Chinese society. Whether the minds behind China's laws create sophisticated new ways to carry out capital punishment or return to brutal public punishments, which aren't so far in the past, will be. If you like the video and you are passionate about history and other intriguing facts, we invite you to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our videos. Also here we'll leave 2 more videos that may be extremely interesting for you. Thanks a lot for watching our short documentary, and see you next time, fellow history fans.